This is Eat the Rules, a podcast about body image, self-worth, anti-dieting, and intersectional feminism. I am your host, Summer Inanen, a professionally trained coach specializing in body image, self-worth, and confidence, and the best-selling author of Body Image Remix. If you're ready to break free of societal standards and stop living behind the number on your scale, then you have come to the right place. Welcome to the show. This is episode 320, and I am replaying the episode that I did with Alexis Conason, clinical psychologist and eating disorder specialist, and author of The Diet-Free Revolution. We are unpacking everything that the research says about weight loss. Is it possible to lose weight in the long term? What do you need to do to achieve that? Plus how learning to eat more mindfully and in a non-diet way can help you to become a more intuitive eater. You can find the links mentioned at summerinanen.com/320. I want to give a shout out to listener R who left this review. This podcast is helpful if you're looking to build self-esteem and self-acceptance. Thank you so much for leaving that review. If you have the means to do so, you can financially contribute to this podcast by going to ko-fi.com. That's ko-fi.com/Summer Inanen, and you will get access to my free ebook, Conquering Self-Doubt. And that helps to support the show and try to keep it on the air for a little bit longer. And if you do not have the financial means to do that, you can leave a review for the show. You can go to Apple Podcasts, search for Eat the Rules, click ratings and reviews, and click to leave a review. Don't forget, I have free stuff for you on my website. You can go to thebodyimagecoach.com and you'll find the Body Image Coaching Roadmap for professionals. As well, you will find the free 10-day body confidence makeover. Okay, this was one of the best or most downloaded episodes that I've ever done, so I wanted to re-air it. And it's such a good review of the research, and it looks at even like the study that was done on participants of The Biggest Loser and what happened to their metabolism and things like that after the show. And so hopefully it's a really helpful reminder of why dieting doesn't work. And I just love kind of getting into like the data and the research around this as well. I want to give a brief content warning for the use of the word obesity that will be used throughout this episode in a clinical sense, just when Alexis refers to some of the research and the studies. Alexis Conason is a clinical psychologist and eating disorder specialist in private practice in New York City. She's the founder of the Anti-Diet Plan, a weight-inclusive online mindful eating program. She was previously a researcher associate at the New York Nutrition Obesity Research Center in affiliation with Columbia University. Her research has been published in peer-reviewed journals. She is a frequent speaker at conferences, and she has been featured widely as an expert on the topics of mindful eating, body image, and diet culture in the media. You can find her on social media at the Anti-Diet Plan. Let's get started with the show. Hello, Alexis. Welcome to the show. I'm so excited to have you here today.
Thank you so much for having me.
I loved reading your book, The Diet-Free Revolution, and there was just so many good quotes from it. I think I told you in the email I sent, but I highlighted so many different quotes and parts of it. And I loved the way that you weaved some storytelling about either real or anonymous clients into the book to really kind of get your points across and everything else. It was really, really good. Yeah. So I'm looking forward to digging into the stuff that you talk about in there today.
Yeah, I'm so excited to dive in.
So why don't you start out by telling our listeners just a little bit about your story and, what prompted you to really get into this work, and, what was your relationship with food like when you were growing up?
Sure. So I think like so many of us, I grew up in a home with a lot of dieting, and there was always this push and pull between, were we going to be kind of good today or be bad today? I was fortunate in the sense that there wasn't a ton of criticism around my body, but there was definitely a lot of criticism. My mom definitely had a lot of criticism around her own body. So I internalized the idea that thinness was kind of just like what we all yearned named after, and that was going to be the path to happiness in life. And also that dieting was a way to kind of compensate for what we ate. So it was really this cycle that, again, I think this is familiar to so many people, but this idea of like indulging and enjoying yourself. And then, we're going to be better tomorrow. We're going to start better tomorrow. So I got really stuck in that cycle. I went on my first diet. I think I was about 8 years old, and it was something that I wanted to do myself. No one put me on a diet, but I, think it was in part like a way to, be closer to my mother, and also just kind of like what I thought that grown-ups did. So I remember being 8 years old and going on a juice fast, and it was like a recipe or a diet prescription that was in one of the many, many diet books that were kind of just like strewn all over our house growing up. And it was one of the first times I remember really feeling preoccupied with food because I was so hungry. I remember going to sleep at night and just like dreaming of what I was going to eat for breakfast. I was starving. And, it kind of, that pattern set me up for many decades of, going on and off these periods of being bad and being good, and thinking that, everything in life would be better if I could just find a way to rein in my eating, get control of myself, and have this ideal body that I was thirsting after. So I was so kind of immersed in that I really set off on a career path to figure this out, because I felt like I can't seem to get this under control for myself. So of course, let me like study this as much as I can, and maybe I'll figure it out. And, when we're a mess around something, of course, like I'll just help other people do this thing that I can't figure out how to do. And I became a psychologist and really had plans to be like a weight loss therapist. I trained working in a bariatric surgery center. I worked for many, many years in obesity research. And it was fortunate that not too long after I started my private practice, again, kind of hung up my shingle with this idea that I'm going to be a weight management psychologist and I'll help people be thin. Thankfully, I attended a training on mindful eating, and the training itself was a very diet-focused training where they handed out like these calorie counting books, and we were supposed to tell people, eat mindfully. And by the way, try to cut out a certain number of calories each week. Makes no sense. But thankfully, there was a group of people at the training who were health at every size professionals. And I had never heard about health at every size before. And just opening up those conversations. I mean, I remember sitting with one person at lunch and kind of just chatting and talking about dieting. And, the person said, but diets don't work. And I was like, what are you talking about? It was like the most bizarre statement. Like it had literally just never occurred to me before that like diets don't work. I, was just so trained and immersed in this world that it's about calories in, calories out, and how can you get people to, increase their motivation and willpower. And the reason that I wasn't able to do it was obviously because there was something wrong with me, and I was, not strong enough and lazy and undisciplined. So just the introduction of that idea that the whole system is, a sham was really, really eye-opening for me. And I'll say I didn't take it all in right away, but the idea kind of reverberated in my mind for a while. And eventually, I started reading, doing more research and really trying to unpack this. And it just all made so much sense. And that was I would say a life-changing moment for me.
So yeah, you mentioned going to these conferences, like these obesity conferences, and hearing the researchers talk about how, like, I guess they weren't getting the results they sort of hoped for with the studies. What was like, and how that was kind of a catalyst to you sort of seeing that, like, okay, this paradigm doesn't work. So talk about your experience with that, just because I'm so curious.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's some of the best evidence for the idea that diets don't work and that long-term weight loss is not sustainable for most people is in the field of obesity research. Because if you look at these studies, and these are done by people who are highly invested in the weight normative paradigm, they've built their careers on it. There's pretty much a consensus that they know how people can lose weight in the short term, but that almost everybody gains it back long term. And that diet and exercise is not the, secret path to, to changing our body the way that like the average person thinks it is, and the way that we've all been told. And that was actually like one of the reasons that I wanted to write this book, was that as I was spending a lot of time in the research field, it was like so clear that it was not about just like eating less and exercising more, that this was, incredibly complicated, and that we were just like encouraging people to do something over and over and over again that we know doesn't work. And not only does it not work, it's actually pretty harmful. So I had a hard time wrapping my head around the discrepancy between like what the research was saying and what was being disseminated to like the average person through just, the mainstream media, the evening news, and the things that even our doctors are telling us. So I wanted to try to bridge that gap a little bit with my book.
Yeah. And you do an amazing job kind of breaking down, some of the studies. And I'd love you to just sort of, touch on some of the details from a couple of them, because I think that, it's just like you said, the information that we're getting from mainstream media and doctors is not backed by the research. And I think that, a lot of people maybe kind of on a surface level know that listening to this podcast, but it's also helpful to just sort of understand a little bit of the nitty gritty in there. So I know one of the studies you mentioned is just like the look ahead study. And I'm curious to know, what you found when you looked into that study.
So I wanted to include that study in my book because I think it's often what people who are invested in the weight normative paradigm point to as like long-term weight loss is possible. And when you look at this study, it is one of the few studies that looks at what they call like an intensive lifestyle intervention, which is basically diet and exercise long-term. They studied people for like a little more than 8 years. And I think the study was supposed to go to 10 years, but they cut it short early because they weren't seeing the results that they wanted to see. And what the study found was that people initially, lost, I think it was like 8% of their body weight or something like that. And then over the first year or so, and then as the study went on, almost everybody gained back the weight. So I think by the end of the study, there was a significant portion of people, or maybe the average, that had maintained about a 4% weight loss. So the the researchers' standard was, they would consider it a success if people lost, I think, like 7% or something at the long-term follow-up. So that wasn't met, yet all of, the medical establishment kind of hailed this study to be a success and to say, look, we can, help people lose weight. But if you look at what they did in this study, this is not the average dieter. They looked at people who, first of all, were committed enough to this and kind of struggling with this enough to sign up for this study. And then they really provided them with like every resource imaginable. So what tends to happen is that, for the average person, like an actual real life person, not in a study, go on a diet and we just have the resources that are, we have the diet plan, maybe we buy some food for it or whatever, we're pretty much on our own. But in this study, the participants were like provided with special diet food. They were provided with gym memberships, and they were provided with weekly counseling where they would like check in with people and have like the research team supporting them to make sure they were staying on plan. And then when they struggled or when they started to regain weight, they were then kind of bombarded with more resources. So sometimes they were given weight loss medication. Sometimes they were given in-home exercise equipment. So, the study researchers like bought them a treadmill or got them into therapy. So, it's just not, I don't think it's like a typical story of what happens. But with all of that, with like every resource imaginable and all this money in funding, that like the success was a 4% weight loss maintained, at, I think it was like 8 years or something like that. And these people were working their butt off for it. They were like exercising regularly, sticking to this diet long-term, so I think that it underscores the idea, like when you talk to most people about like why, who want to lose weight, their goal is not 4% of their weight loss. And if this is what this is what doctors are saying with every resource possible, you can achieve 4% weight loss. That's not going to like sell a lot of diet plans or really motivate people that much. And then, of course, like so many of these studies, they don't look at the risk. They don't look at the people, as much who drop out of the study. They don't look at the impact of eating disorders, how many people develop an eating disorder as in consequence of this. So it's not without risk. And I think the payoff is just really, really lousy.
Yeah, I think that's what stood out the most to me was that, like, if you think about 4%, it's like such a low number. And I think if you even said that to people, that probably wouldn't make or break, like, their happiness or their health or anything that they've sort of mentally associated with weight loss, that, it's not really going to like change your body that much. And the fact that like, that they tout that as being like a success is just ridiculous, because it's counter to kind of what they're really asking of people, which is like much more significant weight changes when I think about like kind of what doctors say to people and everything else.
Yeah. And I think it's counter to what people want and what people would feel is kind of worth that type of really drastic, life-changing behaviors. Like, do you want to, spend hours of your life every single day working on this to, lose a few pounds?
Yeah. And it sounds like it's like kind of like, hey, do you want a disordered relationship with food to, achieve something so minute?
Yeah. And I think, that's one of the other studies that I covered in the book, which I think is really fascinating, is the people in the National Weight Control Registry. So this is, again, I think there is an acknowledgement in the quote unquote obesity research field that weight loss is, long-term weight loss and maintaining that weight loss is very, very rare. So people started to say, okay, we can't induce it in our studies, right? Like the people that we're studying don't seem to be able to lose weight and keep it off. But there are people out there, we all hear about them. They tend to be very loud and very vocal about that they have managed to lose weight and keep it off long-term. So researchers said, those people are out there. Why don't we just look at those people who are naturally able to, who are in, outside of a study environment, able to lose weight and keep it off long-term. So they created the National Weight Control Registry for people who have lost, I forget what it is, the significant amount of weight, but you could look up what the criteria are. It's not even that dramatic of amount of weight, and keep it off for, I think, 2 years, either 1 year or 2 years. And they kind of put these people into a database and polled them on a whole bunch of stuff. And another group of researchers came and looked at these people who are in the National Weight Control Registry and said, you know what? When we look at what these people are doing every day, it looks an awfully lot like what we see in our clients, our patients with chronic enduring anorexia. And I think that's really interesting. In that study, they came to the conclusion, this is how twisted the obesity research field is. And actually, this study was done by a group of eating disorder researchers, which is in many ways even scarier. But they came to the conclusion not that there's a whole bunch of people on this National Weight Control Registry that might have an eating disorder. They came to the conclusion of, how can we take these lessons, this is the language they use, these lessons from people who have severe and enduring anorexia and apply it to fat people. So basically, how can we make fat people have anorexia? And it's one of the most disturbing studies that I've read, honestly. What I take away from that data is that, for the rare people who are sustaining, weight loss long term, it's often not in the healthiest way. I mean, if you look at the National Weight Control Registry, these people are spending, I think it's something like 2 hours exercising every day. They track every bite of food that they eat. They think about what they're eating almost all the time. They are incredibly restrictive. They feel a lot of anxiety if they veer off course from their diet, or if they're in an environment where they're eating foods that they don't consider to be safe. Again, I think it's a lot of the things that we do see in our clients with eating disorders. And, rather than just celebrating weight loss whenever we see it, which is often what happens, especially in the medical profession, I think that really it should be a flag to be assessing for eating disorders and to be, seeing for real what's going on with people.
Yeah, that's a really good way of saying it. One of the other things that you talked about in the book was kind of, the set point and what happens to our weight when it's pulled below the set point. And you referenced the Biggest Loser Is it an actual study that they did on participants of The Biggest Loser and like what happened with that? I'm so like, it was just so fascinating to me what happened to their bodies.
Yeah, there's two really interesting studies on set point. One was done like I think in the early 90s, and it was one of the first studies on set point. And that was done with people who they actually had stay in the hospital for like in this research center for prolonged periods of time. One of the things I thought was really interesting about this study was that they looked at, lean, quote unquote, lean participants and, higher weight participants, and had them all live in the hospital for a set period of time so that they could assess everything, everything that went in and everything that went out of their body, and had these like metabolic chambers that they were in. But the lean participants only stayed in the hospital for like a month or something, whereas some of the larger body participants were in the hospital for like a year or 2 years. And I just can't wrap my head around what's going on for someone and what our culture does to people to make us think that living in the hospital and also the lean participants were paid for their participation in the study, and the higher weight participants were not paid. They were just given the promise of weight loss. And that was like enough for people to stay in the hospital for 2 years.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. Like, I don't know. That's one of the things that stuck with me about the study. But what the data actually found was that when people lose a significant amount of weight, metabolically, their body tries to restore it, right? We know this now is set point theory. It's this idea that our body is kind of like a thermostat a little bit, where we have like a comfortable range of weight that our body wants to maintain. And if it goes beyond, if our weight dips below that range, our body starts to think, uh-oh, something's wrong. Oh, we're in a famine, we're starving, we don't have enough access to food. We have to slow down metabolism and send cues to try to encourage us to seek out food. So this is one of the reasons that we know that while people can lose weight through dieting or exercise or kind of this like calorie and energy imbalance, long term, that's not sustainable because our body is very much invested in keeping us alive. Like that's a good thing. And part of the way that it does that is by encouraging us to eat when we're starving and when we're not having enough nutrition. And it's very, very hard to fight against that. So this study that was done in the 90s started to observe like that a slowing of metabolism and an increase in ghrelin levels. That's a hormone that makes us feel more hungry. I think there was a decrease in leptin, which is kind of the satiation hormone. So people, would eat and eat and eat and have a lot of trouble feeling full. And then this was pretty much replicated with a few other findings in terms of like what the body does to try to help us regain weight after we've lost weight by studying the contestants from The Biggest Loser. So they looked at, a bunch of the contestants from one of the seasons of The Biggest Loser. This was an NIH funded study, and they essentially found the same thing, found that like people who had lost all this weight, when you looked at the contestants, this is why we never see like The Biggest Loser follow-up show, right? Because if you look at people 1 or 2 years down the road, people have regained the weight. And what they found, which was really interesting, was that metabolically, these people look completely different than someone of the same weight who had never lost weight to begin with. So, this is why I think we have to be so careful not to generalize. Sometimes we see research studies that say, well, people who are thinner have better health outcome. Well, okay, but that's not comparing people who are, where their natural set point weight is in a thinner body size to someone who's now weight reduced. Because we know that metabolically, someone who's set point or who, has lived most of their life in a larger body size, who's currently at a smaller weight, does not look metabolically the same as someone whose natural set point weight in that range, even if they're currently at the same weight.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah. So like the impact is pretty significant in terms of like what it does to those hormones.
Exactly. And it basically means that people, if you're weight reduced, like you're hungry all the time, your metabolism is slowing down, you're getting these cues to these like, part of the reward center of the brain is just encouraging you to like seek out food all the time. So we become really preoccupied with food. We're thinking about food all the time. We're trying to find ways to, eat. And it becomes all consuming. And, it's not a matter of willpower that people regain the weight. It's really a matter of physiology.
Yeah, totally, totally. And so like kind of hearing this, I'm sure there's people listening that are kind of thinking, and I've heard this before from clients, like, have I totally messed up my body? Like, can I recover from decades of chronic dieting? Like, will my hormones go back to the way that they were? How do you answer that?
So I think it's a hard question, but at the end of the day, we are where we are right now. And I think that it's important to start off just by having a ton of compassion for ourselves, that we live in this culture that made us believe that the best thing that we could do for ourselves was to try to restrict our eating. And I think that our bodies do tend to be resilient and regain some sort of balance in terms of what is right for you. Now, that balance may not be, your set point weight of what your body was like when you were 20 years old. And also just like our bodies change over time naturally. And I think that a lot of people look back to this time of, well, I messed up my body because, I weighed X when I started dieting and now, I'm much bigger. But like also maybe when you started dieting, you were 15 years old and now you're 40 and your body is not going to work the same way. So I think it's important, in a way, I don't think that the question is so relevant, although I do have a ton of empathy for just like the struggle around body image and how scary it is to stop dieting and not really be sure exactly what your body is going to do. But I do think that, the more important question is kind of how can we care for ourselves now in the body that we're in and find a way to come back to ourselves with compassion and nourish ourselves and honor, get back to a place of like honoring our body and reconnecting with our hunger and fullness and trusting ourselves and just embark in that process. And part of that process is trusting that wherever our body's going to end up is going to be okay.
Yeah, yeah. It's easier said than done, I think, for a lot of people. It just feels like sometimes like you're coming really out of control, even though you never had control in the first place. Actually, that reminds me of one of the stories that you shared in the book, and you had like one of the clients kind of list out all the things that they wanted. Or what was it? It was like all the things that happen when they try to lose weight. What do you remember? I'm confusing my words, but I thought it was really smart.
I kind of do both. And these are from work that I do with clients as well, that like so many people, first of all, we look at what are the fears around not dieting. And a lot of people come in and they say, well, if I give up dieting, I'm going to eat in a way that feels out of control. I'm going to, my body's going to react in ways that I don't know what it's going to do. And it feels really scary. But I think that when we go in, really dive to the next level of that and what's underlying that is, people are not, if they're coming in to try to heal their relationship with food, we can kind of assume that things aren't going so great as it is. And oftentimes many of the things that people fear from giving up dieting is actually what is happening with dieting. So,
yes,
it's like,
that was it.
yeah. So it's like, well, that's already happening. So, maybe that'll continue to happen or maybe it won't. But my hope is that people are open to trying something new. And I think that, if people are listening to this podcast, people are, looking to learn more about mindful eating and intuitive eating, it's coming from a place of just being tired of doing the same thing over and over again. And in some level, I think that people are open to a different approach.
Yeah, absolutely. I I see it, especially once you've been doing it for like 20, 30 years. It's like this, like you physically and mentally can't do it anymore. And I think that can be a catalyst to healing.
Yeah, it's exhausting. It's exhausting going through that same cycle over and over again. And especially the mental kind of the self-criticism, the beating ourselves up and the amount of space it takes up in our brain. It's tiring.
Mm-hmm. So what do you say to someone who says, like, I have to lose weight for my health?
So I think that there is so much research at this point showing that our health is not determined by our weight. There was, for example, a big research review that just came out recently. It was covered in the New York Times that showed that, again, that fitness is a much more key variable in terms of determining our health than our weight. But that's not the first study to show that. We've been hearing for years and years, if not a decade or more, emerging research looking at the factors that do impact health. And, this is something that a lot of people don't want to hear, but like most of what impacts health is totally out of our control. The biggest predictor of health is income. So we know that across the income span, the more money that you make, the more wealth that you have, the longer that you're going to live. And, income is not something that we have a tremendous amount of control over, especially, wealth in this country. Some of the other, huge impacts on our health is genetics. By and far, that is one of the biggest ones. And then when we look at the things that we can control, diet and exercise is not the main factor. Like, yes, okay, fitness does have an impact on our health. Certainly for people who are wanting to improve their health through fitness, that's an option that we have more control over. But also we need to look at things like stress management, because we know that chronic stress takes a, toll on our health. We also know that being on that, dieting on again, off again cycle is a stressful experience. We know that experiencing weight stigma creates a state of chronic stress. We know that, living in a marginalized body is a stressful experience. So when we hear studies that are like, well, you have to lose weight for your health, thinner people are healthier than, fat people. There's so much that study isn't telling us, because we're looking at not only, people at different weights, but people are being exposed to different levels of weight stigma, people who are being treated with people who have different levels of access to care in the medical setting. Like if you go to the doctor and you're constantly being told that you have to lose weight and that there's something wrong with your body and being fat shamed at the doctor's office, that's a really awful experience. And it makes people want to avoid the doctor's office. And we know that people who are at higher weights tend to get less preventative care because going to the doctor is an awful experience and they don't want to do it. And that makes a ton of sense. Also, when they do go to the doctor's office, oftentimes people are not being treated with adequate care. They're being told to lose weight instead of, actually diagnosed with whatever brought them into the doctor's office to begin with, or they're being told you can't have this medical procedure until you lose weight, or, so it's a very complicated story, but I think what's not complicated is that it is pretty clear that weight is not the be all end all when it comes to our health. And that if you are interested in improving your health, there's a lot that we can do completely independent of our weight, stress management, not smoking cigarettes, not drinking alcohol to excess, getting a decent night's sleep, connecting with friends. Like we know that loneliness has a big impact on our health. And, these things are sometimes a little less sexy than like what the newest miracle food is, or, how many, ounces of flaxseed to add to your smoothie, your kale smoothie in the morning. But these are the things that really do make an impact. And we often, when we're focusing on losing weight, we discount those things. We say we're not going to go get lunch with friends because I might eat something that's not on my diet, or I'm not going to, I'm going to wake up at 5 o'clock in the morning to make sure that I go to the gym. And so what if that means I'm getting 5 hours of sleep?
Yeah, exactly. Like you see how dieting kind of, really is harmful to your health in many ways, like how it, like you said, impacts stress and sleep and sometimes socialization in some cases. Yeah. Yeah. So, in your book, you talk a lot about, the importance of mindfulness. And you mentioned up front that like mindfulness was sort of one of those things that really like kind of opened your mind and helped you find health at every size. So why is mindfulness so important?
I think mindfulness is such a powerful tool or practice, really, because it's not just about, changing our relationship to food. It does. But I think fundamentally, mindfulness can really shift the way that we see ourselves and the way that we interact in the world. So, one of the skills of mindfulness is, for people who aren't familiar, I'll start off by saying that mindfulness is really just the process of being fully aware and present in the current moment. So, most of us live our life kind of going along. We're pretty checked out, and we're often not aware of like what's happening in our body, what's happening emotionally with us, how we're feeling, even like what we're doing. We really kind of are like going through in this zoned out kind of way. And mindfulness start is a meditation practice that helps us just increase our awareness. So in terms of like food and our body, it really starts, one of the most powerful things that I think mindfulness does is just we can start to observe the things that we're saying to ourselves. So at the foundation of changing anything about ourselves is awareness. It's just, we have to see what we're doing before we can try to change it at all. And then I think also we have to try to foster a sense of compassion for ourselves, a sense of collaboration, like that we're not our worst enemies, that we're able to be on the same team with ourselves, working with kindness to have, if there's changes we want to make in our life. And so many of us are just mired in this constant self-criticism. If we pause and just listen to the things that we're saying to ourselves, it's like things we wouldn't say to our worst enemy, let alone someone that we care about. And I think that even there, mindfulness can go a long way in terms of changing the inner dialogue, observing what we're saying to ourselves, starting to notice, maybe, whoa, that's really, harsh. What is there something else I could be, shifting kind of. I don't think that it's helpful to try to erase those thoughts or make them go away completely, because kind of the more we focus on something, the more that it sticks around. Mm-hmm. But I think when we notice that, we can kind of say, okay, there's a thought. It's not necessarily the truth. It's just a thought. And what do I really need right now? How can I be more kind or loving to myself in this moment? And I think that that's, one of the key things that mindfulness does. Now, on a more practical level, I think that mindfulness also can help us be more attuned with like when we're hungry, what foods we're in the mood to eat, when we feel satisfied, what it feels like to eat past the point of fullness, when our eating is driven by an emotional experience versus a physical one. It just brings more awareness to everything. And I think that for many people who have maybe started to explore like mindful eating or intuitive eating, especially just like through social media, it can feel like the sense of like, don't diet, diets don't work, eat whatever you want. And that can seem really overwhelming because there's no way to know, well, how do I know what I want to eat? Or how do I know when I'm hungry? And I think that mindfulness can be kind of the missing link there, because when we've spent so much of our lives in conflict with ourselves and really tuning out from our mind and our body, mindfulness is something that can help us just hear naturally what our body is trying to tell us. And many of us need a little practice to get back there.
Yeah, it's challenging. Like, and I know you kind of mentioned this in the book, and I always feel this way. Like, as soon as you kind of mentioned meditation, I was like, oh, I got to like leave the room. Like, I can't do this. Like, and I actually did your 5-minute meditation because I was like,
oh, cool.
Let's try this. And I honestly found it so hard. Like, I was like 1 minute in, I was like, is this thing over yet? But then, I think you made a huge point that I feel like is not necessarily new to me, but for some reason it like really stood out this time. And it was like, the purpose of this is to just like observe those thoughts. So I was like, okay, like just notice that this is bothering me. Like notice that this is hard, versus like trying to just be like, this isn't working because my mind isn't quieting. And I think that that was like a huge differentiating factor. And that's something that you really try to like bring home is like, okay, the purpose isn't to like get into this and like have totally clear mind and clear thoughts. It's like to just observe like what you're actually thinking and doing, like while this experience is happening. But I have such a challenge with it. That 5 minutes felt so long for me.
Yeah. And, I think I'm a big proponent of mindfulness is something that should fit into your life, into your daily routine. And doesn't mean that we have to like spend 20 minutes or even 5 minutes every day, building a meditation practice. I often have people when they're just starting, start with like 3 minutes of meditation. You can start with 1 minute if 5 minutes feels overwhelming. But yeah, it's exactly what you're saying, is that mindfulness doesn't have to be this like completely serene experience where we're like finding some kind of existential bliss. Like it's really just about sitting with yourself for 5 minutes. And that can be uncomfortable. Like it can be hard to just slow down and be with ourselves. And it's not about quieting your mind or anything like that, or only focusing on your breath. A lot of the meditation that I teach is kind of centered on focusing on your breath. But the idea is not to stay totally, focused on your breath where our mind isn't wandering off. It's to use the breath as a tool to observe the mind and to notice when it wanders off. And I think that there's a lot of value in just that process of noticing. Like I've often left a meditation period where my mind is going all over the place, and maybe I notice that I keep going to like thoughts of worry or thoughts of whatever. And I leave the meditation. I'm like, wow, I'm actually feeling pretty anxious right now. And maybe when I sat down to meditate, I wasn't aware of that. So that I think in many ways is a gift because we're able to say, okay, like, wow, I have this thing going on today. What do I need to try to care for myself? Because I am feeling, maybe I am feeling a little more anxious than usual. And I need to make sure that I am doing things that are comforting, that are soothing, that I'm focusing on self-care, that maybe I'm not going to go do this stressful thing that I have planned at the end of the day. So I think the awareness is really where everything starts.
Yeah. And I think that's really key. And I love that you highlighted that. So I know we have to wrap things up here. Tell everyone just a little bit about your book, The Diet-Free Revolution.
So The Diet-Free Revolution is a book. I've been wanting to write this for so long. I feel really so fortunate that I've finally had the opportunity. I started working on this book almost 10 years ago. Initially, my goal was to kind of translate some of what I was learning in the research field to, the general public. But also as it evolved and my work evolved, I really thought about what I was doing with my clients. I've been working with people struggling with mostly binge eating disorder and other kinds of disordered eating for about 10 years now. And there were things that I see over and over again, often as a product of diet culture, of, tools that have been really helpful for people. So I tried to think in this book, if someone's coming to see me and they're still maybe have one foot in diet culture, right? They're have maybe heard about this thing, intuitive eating or mindful eating. And I'm using the words interchangeably here, but they're not the same thing. But, maybe they've heard of kind of like an anti-diet philosophy. They know that what they've been doing isn't working, but they're not sure where to go from there. And maybe they do still want to lose weight. Maybe they are still holding on to this sense that my body's not okay right now. What is the work that kind of the universal pieces of the work that go from bringing a person there to helping them really work towards a place of more like food freedom or, just being unburdened by this struggle around food. So I created a 10-step program because one of the things that I think is important is that people have structure. And it was intentional that it kind of mimics the idea of like a diet plan that's like 10 steps to lose 10 pounds, although this time you're not trying to lose 10 pounds, although you're losing kind of the weight of diet culture. But I think that oftentimes people get overwhelmed at the beginning, and there's something that feels safer about having a structure and this sense of here are some things that you can do. So the book works through, at the beginning, we talk a lot about some of the research of like why diets don't work, what the research actually really says about our health. And if we want to improve our health, what are some things that we can do? And then it goes through the skills of mindfulness and mindful eating. And we also speak about, what to do, kind of how to handle what many people call like quote unquote emotional eating, and how to understand more about how our emotions impact our relationship with food. And then one of my favorite chapters is the last one, which really gets into the sense of like, now that we have a little bit more headspace, that we're not, thinking about what to eat all the time, how do we live our lives in a way that feels authentic and aligned with our values? So we talk a little bit about values, and we also talk about pleasure, which I think there's such a taboo, especially for women in our culture, around experiencing pleasure in our bodies, whether it's around sex, whether it's around food. So I tried to dive in a little bit about what is it like and how can we really live our lives more engaged, kind of reclaiming our pleasure around our bodies.
Yeah, perfect. Well, I loved the way it was written. I loved the stories that you used. I loved how there were specific kind of like summaries and things to do, like actual exercises at the end of each chapter. I thought it was really well put together. And so I'm excited for other people to go and grab a copy. So with that said, where can people find more of you?
So people can find me. My website is drconason.com. You can find information about me. And I also have a small group practice in New York City where we specialize in the treatment of binge eating disorder. They can find me on Instagram at the Anti-Diet Plan, and I think on most social media at the Anti-Diet Plan.
And I'll link to all of that in the show notes. Sorry, go ahead.
Yes. Sorry, no, I was just going to say, and the book is available wherever books are sold.
Amazing. Yeah, I'll link to that too. And I really, really enjoyed it. And I really appreciate you taking the time to be here today. It was so awesome to have you. Thank you, Alexis.
Oh, thank you so much.
Rock on.
I hope you enjoyed listening to this one again, or maybe for the first time. It's definitely one of my favorites. I love referring people to this episode, so was happy to reshare it. I will have new episodes next time, which will be in 2 weeks again. And thank you so much for listening today. You can find the links mentioned at summerinnanen.com/320. Rock on. I'm Summer Innanen, and I want to thank you for listening today. You can follow me on Instagram and Facebook at Summer Innanen. And if you haven't yet, go to Apple Podcasts, search Eat the Rules, and subscribe, rate, and review this show. I would be so grateful. Until next time, rock on.